Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 190, November 4th to November 10th, 1864. Last week, we wrapped up Price's expedition into Missouri. Some call the Battle of Westport as the Gettysburg of the West. I would probably not go so far as that, but the sort of underlying theme is that there is a last hurrah, so to speak, for Missouri. I see it as only fitting because we are getting an end to these actions in Missouri, where in 1861 we had a lot of the beginning actions of the war in that state, so it is coming full circle. This week, we will wrap up a few items that we may have missed, notably in Virginia and Tennessee. Before we do that, though, we must mention Lincoln and his official reelection. Of course, before we do that, we do need to talk about our Patreon content. And, of course, we are flipping the page over here, flipping the calendar over to November, and we will be doing a movie review back to movies, as mentioned, Alvarez Kelly, starring William Holden and Richard Widmark, and we are going to talk about the beefsteak raid, and that's something that we talked about in a few episodes prior here. The events in that movie are depicting that particular raid, a fairly famous raid here by Wade Hampton, so we're going to compare and contrast with that movie. If that sounds like it would interest you, we do have other movie reviews we've done in the past. We've done the hits, Gettysburg, Glory, all of those we've done. And then we also have some memoir reviews and picture slideshows of modern-day battlefields talking about the events that happened there. So if any of that sounds like it would interest you, there is a link in the show description, and those proceeds go toward the general upkeep of the show. They are greatly appreciated. If you research the Civil War for long enough, you will find that there are a handful of moments that can be labeled the end of the Confederacy, or the moment they lost the war. I have previously talked about how Mill Springs was the unraveling of the southern states, and while that is more of a jest about the concept of there being one event that really leads to the end of the war, there is some truth into things lining up just right. While the re-election of Abraham Lincoln is not the reason why the South loses the war, it does close the door on the last realistic hope of the war coming to a peaceful conclusion without subjugation. We have talked about how the war is sometimes a what have you done for me lately kind of conflict. Earlier in 1862, with all the victories that were happening across the nation, with McClellan unable to take control of the rebel capital during the peninsula, and then the 7 days, it kind of washes away all those other events. Lincoln is quoted as to having said as much. New Orleans had fallen. Albert Sidney Johnston was dead, and the main army in the West had been defeated. Nashville, another key logistical center for the Confederates, had likewise fallen. Chattanooga was under threat. All of these events were showing the Union winning the war, and yet the failure of Little Mac changed public as well as foreign opinion. In some ways, in that regard, it's a little fitting that McClellan loses to Lincoln in the presidential election. The young Napoleon had certainly bumped heads with the president, and overall, in my opinion, was just difficult for little or no reason. We can sympathize with McClellan and the pressure that had been put on him, and while there are different opinions, there is a good amount of traction that he does win at Antietam in a situation where the Union could not afford a loss. In 1864, there is a combination of events that mirror 62 fairly well. A naval action closes a major Confederate port, there is a victory in the subtheater, and the primary field army of the Union is knocking on the door, or in this case, the back door of the Confederate capital. When we compare both of these years and these events, we can see the importance of Grant sticking to the campaign against Lee. Had he failed despite Mobile and Atlanta, then things could seriously have been different. Lack of power for the Peace Democrats would spell really the conclusion of the war. Lee has no more reinforcements. Hood is about to show that he is really no Braxton Bragg, which is a difficult thing to say, but he will almost certainly fail as the secondary field commander. Price has failed, and Kirby Smith will just hold on to the Trans-Mississippi as best he can. Lincoln had done a good job in setting up a system in which the southern states would be reintegrated into the Union. He was committed to winning the war. It's always easier to say that certain things can be cherry-picked from agendas, but of course it's always easier when you know the outcome of the events in the end. Just know that the Confederates are going to be trying to at least delay the inevitable from here on out. November 8th, 1864 becomes the official day in which Lincoln is re-elected. I might sound like a broken record as well, but it also is really highlighting how important the main theater of the war is. Even in contemporary sources, you're seeing that there is an emphasis on what is happening between Lee and Grant, prior to that between Lee and McClellan. So if we're taking our 1862 comparison, then you can say, well, McClellan should have stuck around Richmond, because if you have all these other victories abroad, and certainly things were looking that way, New Orleans was a huge loss and sometimes is overlooked on the part of the war in general, but New Orleans is certainly a bigger loss than Atlanta was, and certainly Mobile being closed is also fairly big, but it's not the end of the world for the Confederacy, and wouldn't have been in 1862. So you have these other victories. You need to at least be breaking even, and McClellan is unable to do that during his Peninsula campaign, and then subsequently the 7 days. He loses. He's forced to go back to the northern part of Virginia. Withdraw his army, right? Start that process. John Pope comes in. So that's how that kind of shakes down. But if you're like Grant and you're at least trying some things, it's not to say that Grant is really wowing in the field. His tactics have so far been, in my opinion, sort of average, right? He's not this great general that's coming in and is using maneuver to win these battles, but he is understanding what it's going to take to win the war, and that's to persist on this path, suffering pretty heavy casualties in the process, but at least being able to continue this pressure. And that, combined with these other victories abroad, is really what's going to be on paper getting Lincoln back into the White House. And certainly staying in the White House is, once again, really what is the final nail in the coffin for the Confederacy. So speaking of Petersburg, we will turn our attention back there. Remember that there had been some success at Peebles Farm the last time we were here, meaning that maybe there could be continued exploitation on the part of the Union. By this time, we see that Early has been defeated at Cedar Creek. Any reinforcement to Lee is going to be minimal, if at all. Despite the success of the defense so far, Grant is going to try to expand the line and overlap him somewhere. This had been the strategy so far, as we have seen at Deep Bottom on the right flank, and now the Boydton Plank Road on the left flank. It will be the latter that we will focus on in this week. Winfield Scott Hancock will try again to move his command in this direction. On October 27th, he will do so. Hancock would lead the assault along with Park's 9th Corps and Gregg's cavalry supporting. Warren would also cross over Hatcher's Run if necessary, trying to turn the flank of the rebels. Advancing toward the South Side Railroad would be key, as well as cutting off that line for rebel use. A.P. Hill, who had needed to relinquish command to Harry Heath, would still have his 3rd Corps troops in this sector, and would be supported by Wade Hampton's cavalry. Crawford and Park would try to put pressure on the Confederate works, thus trying to pin down the rebels, turning the flank if possible, and allowing for success from the 2nd Corps. We have an account from a staff officer of the action in that part of the line. October 27th, about 9 a.m., General Griffin was in line of battle and skirmishing on the north bank. 9:30 started with the escort to reconnoiter the north bank of Hatcher's Run from Armstrong's Mill up. Found a regiment of the 2nd Corps just leaving the rifle pits opposite that mill. These rifle pits had been vacated by the enemy in the morning. I supposed at that time that they were continuous on the south of the creek and crossed it somewhere opposition Griffin's left, connecting with the breastworks opposite Griffin's front. Coming up the creek, found one rebel, been dead in the wood, who fired at us and ran. Stuck afield a while, found the left of Griffin's picket line, in the western edge of the field, resting on the run. The south bank of the run appeared thickly wooded all the way. Returned at 10:15. About 10:30, Generals Meade arrived. I explained my reconnaissance to the generals. General Grant then ordered General Meade to have one of the division of the 5th Corps sent across the run at the mill and march up behind the breastwork so as to uncover General Griffin's front and enable him to advance. About 11:30, General Bragg on the right, Hoffman on the left, Maryland Brigade in reserve. The line marched by right of companies to the front, a strong skirmish line ahead. At this time, Generals Grant and Meade passed the sawmill on their way to Hancock. They stopped 5 minutes to talk. At 12:30, rode with Colonel Wainwright out the road toward the steam sawmill, turned to the right at the first clearing, where there was an abandoned house. Went down a small patch leading from the northwest corner of the field toward the creek, found Crawford's line, had got that far, and had halted for a few minutes to gain more ground to the left. Returned on the creek to our headquarters at the sawmill, woods very thick, and found that the rifle pits ended 200 yards above the mill. As soon as I came back, I thought I would have time to go to the 2nd Corps and see what they were doing and be back in time before Crawford would strike anything. Started at 1 for the 2nd Corps. Road leads through dense woods for nearly 3 miles. One brigade of General Mott's division was lying in the road just before you came to the open fields. As I came out to the field, I saw Generals Grant, Meade, and Hancock at a house on the left. This was very large, 3/4 mile wide by 2.5 long, running north and south. I was told the plank road ran along the western edge of the field. General Egan's division was forming line of battle, facing north, and posted about 300 yards north of the road I was on. His right rested on the wood, and left on the plank road, or somewhere near it. He was just completing the formation of the line. At this time, I heard firing and cannonading southeast of Mrs. Rainey's, which I supposed to be cavalry. There was also infantry skirmishing to the northwest across the plank road. As I passed General Egan, who was standing in front of his line, a battery of ours in his front, say yards opened. I went up to see what they were firing at, found it was a section of brass battery firing at long range toward the west across the plank road at a rifle battery of the enemy. 1/4 mile to the north of this section, in a ravine near a house, which I understand is Burgess's Tavern, was the other section of our brass battery firing at the rebel battery. The enemy fired all his shots at this section and was knocking it pretty badly. The right flank of this section was protected by about 100 cavalry drawn up in line beyond. Through farther north, I could see troops of ours. While I was standing on that, another rebel battery opened from some point on the north side of Hatcher's Run. The first shot fortunately burst 100 yards from me, else it would have knocked me over. I left then. Saw a little road going northeast by east toward the run. Went 200 yards down the road, saw nothing, came to the point where I had first entered the large field. Saw another road here leading southeast by east. I thought I might strike Crawford by here leading southeast by east. I thought I might strike Crawford by following that road. I went down the road nearly half a mile when I saw 2 rebels standing across the road. Turned around and came back. On the way back, I met Bingham with General Hancock's escort. He was sent down this road to whether he could find General Crawford. He said General Meade had told General Hancock to send someone down for that purpose. I told Bingham that he might find Crawford if he kept on long enough, but to keep a good lookout, as there might be rebels on the road. It seems he went through without seeing any rebels and found Crawford near the Crow House. He returned safely by the same route. Later in the afternoon, when Hancock's right was driven in, Bingham was sent down the same road to get Crawford's assistance, but he was captured before he got to the field around the Crow House. About 2 a little later, I left the 2nd Corps and returned to the sawmill on the creek. When I left, General Meade was still at General Hancock's. Ricketts returned at that moment and said he knew where General Crawford was. General Warren and staff started to find General Crawford via steam sawmill and Crow's house. I went to the farther end of that field and found Crawford where Ricketts had left him. All of us went into the woods to hunt him. Came upon his line of battle very unexpectedly. He was moving about 15 degrees west. He said his right rested on the creek, said he lost time by mistaking a branch for the main creek, was separated from the rest of our staff, and followed the line of battle with General Bragg. It was now, say, 2:45. Presently, skirmishers to fire, and then the main line commenced to fire. The troops were a little scared, and many stragglers began running to the rear. But few bullets seemed to come from the enemy. Our line then commenced to cheer and advanced rapidly, firing all the while. The firing from the enemy was very feeble. At about 3:30, the line stopped advancing, and most of the firing ceased. I rode up to Bragg's skirmish line, found the right of it on the creek, and directly in front of it the end of the rebel breastwork on the other side. The lower end of it was vacated. At this moment, a squad of, say, 20 rebels appeared on top of the hill, opposite, and fired down on us. My orderly was killed, and I returned lower down the creek. Found Griffin's skirmish line connecting with Bragg's line of battle. About a dozen of Griffin's men were on Crawford's side of the creek, having crossed on a tree. They had no officer with them. I told the men to hunt their officers and tell them the rebels had left their breastworks and to go up and occupy it. I then went to General Crawford and asked him why he had halted at the very moment when he had victory in his grasp. He replied he had positive orders from General Warren not to advance another step. At this moment, Captain Daly came up and begged hard to be allowed to cross the creek with 50 men and clear out the line of breastworks. Permission was refused. The creek was waist deep here, backwater from some dam. I then left to find General Warren and explained to him the situation. Someone told me he had gone to General Hancock's right just before Crawford's attack commenced. I started on the road from the western end of the Crow Field, got a little way into the woods, when I heard some suspicious noises, and thought it best not to try it. Found General Warren about 4 o'clock near the sawmill. Captain Bache had just come with a message from General Meade. Explained the state of affairs, went back to General Crawford with an order to take possession of the breastworks if he could cross the creek. Rejoined General Crawford about 4:45. Little firing going on. Was astonished to see rebel stragglers coming in on our left and rear. They report Wilcox's division in the woods a short distance behind us. General Crawford had just changed the front of one brigade to look out for this contingency. I delivered my order to him, but we both concluded it would not be advisable to make the attack under the circumstances. 5:15, growing dark rapidly, started back. Some of the rebel prisoners had some of the 2nd Corps prisoners. They reported that Hancock's division had been flanked by them and had broken and run. This was the first intimation that General Crawford heard that matters had been going wrong with the 2nd Corps. When I got back near the Crow House, voices shouted out of the pines, "Stop that man on horseback." They turned out to be 8 rebels under charge of 2 of our men who had lost their way. I brought them in. These men of ours had been taken prisoners by the rebels in the first place, but not one of the whole party knew where they were. So they had made up their minds to follow the first man who knew where anywhere was. At 5:45, reached our headquarters, pitch dark and raining. Captain Cope came in shortly afterward with 8 rebels. Moved headquarters to the Armstrong house about 6:30. Orders were sent to General Crawford to withdraw at 3 o'clock by Lieutenant Colonel Osborne. He had already built a bridge over the creek. The withdrawal was effected by daylight without any pursuit. During the night, the 2nd Corps withdrew from the south side of the run. So one of the reasons why I wanted to read this one is that it's very kind of minute by minute, like very kind of checking off the events that happened. And in some ways, it's very interesting to see that they're kind of trying to put together the events, right? Like it's one thing to read a book about a battle or an event and have everything kind of already filtered for you. But in this kind of scenario, this probably would have been what the officers are writing down, right? They're trying to make sure that they understand the course of events so then they could have proper reporting from there on out, right? Certainly, if you're a staff officer or if you're a sub-officer in one of these commands, you're probably sending what you're writing to your superior, who's then putting that together and he's sending that up the ladder, right? So you want to make sure you're getting things right. So this is very much, we got times in here that's not always the case in some of these reports where there's not this kind of, well, this happened at 9:30 and then at 10 o'clock this happened and then probably about 10:15, right? But you're trying to, and we've mentioned this before, how time is very mix or match in the Civil War where there's not just one time, right? A lot of clocks are different. So you're trying to put things together. Sometimes it's important that you have the time, but you're probably not going to be 100% correct either way. Also captured here is the confusion of the conflict, right? You're trying to put things together. It's another thing where, if you're reading about it, you have a nice little map. I like maps when I'm going over some of these events, right? Or, all of them, the battles, some of them are kind of like even detailed enough to have sections of certain battles, right? Or bigger ones, Gettysburg, Chickamauga, what have you, right? But they obviously didn't have that in the Civil War. So you're trying to make sure you know where everybody is. And if you can't see a division, a brigade, because there's a whole bunch of trees or, there's a hill in the way, then you have to find them. So there's a lot of accounts in this particular passage of, I got to go find them, I'm writing, trying to find them, I'm going the wrong way. There's rebels in the road. Like, obviously, when you have two armies that are in close proximity, when you have a combat situation, that's going to happen, right? You have accounts famously in some cases where orderlies are captured or, individuals are riding into the ranks of the other side. So you have that, and that's kind of why this is a good illustration of that. And then you have finally here toward the end, you have rebels and Union soldiers who have sort of made prisoners of each other. And then they are saying, well, we're kind of lost. So I guess we're just going to find out where the next person is going, and then we'll just follow them, right? Now that's actually something that I've seen in several accounts, especially in these latter stages of the war. You have individuals on both sides who are essentially conscripts coming into the army, so they don't really care whether they become a prisoner or not. As long as I'm hopefully getting fed, or as long as hopefully I'm not going to be killed in a battle, then that's fine with me. So you have kind of instances of this, of these individuals who are just kind of like trying to survive together. And you see this everywhere, Eastern theater, the sub-theater of the war, right, as well. There are all kinds of accounts of that. So I think, once again, this illustrates that very well. So to give us a better idea of exactly what's going on, because, again, this account we just read is fairly confusing. It's very detailed, but also sort of confusing and putting it into the whole picture. In this sector, we have A.P. Hill's 3rd Corps, his command being relinquished in favor of Harry Heath, who was supported by Hampton's cavalry. Heath and Hampton would see an opportunity in isolating and destroying the Federals, as there had been a gap in the line between Hancock and the 5th Corps. We kind of heard about that in the account here, how there's rebels in between them. They can't find each other. They're disconnected. So that's where that's coming from. Billy Mahone would again launch a flank attack that would slice into the Union lines. But his success would actually be too great, as he would find himself surrounded on 3 sides by Union troops. In fact, Gregg's dismounted troopers had not been checked by Hampton's men, and therefore were available to help in the repulse. Mahone's command would be thrown into chaos, but Hancock would not follow up. Haight held the ground gained, but was also in a precarious position. He would withdraw his command, the Union suffering 1,700 casualties compared to 1,300 Confederates. Amazingly, Mahone's command had not seen the success it was used to in these battles on the left flank. And by that we mean there are several of these instances where it seems like almost repetitive, right? Are we talking about the same battle? Billy Mahone is constantly exploiting the ground to his advantage. He's coming up, he's popping into situations where he's wedging himself, he's flanking the Federal line, and obviously he's not able to necessarily duplicate that here. He is striking out at the Union Army, but it's not quite as successful as these other actions. We need to say goodbye to 2 officers this week following the first battle of Boydton Plank Road. While they are not gone from our story, the last field command would have occurred for both. The first is the larger of the 2 figures, Winfield Scott Hancock. Hancock has still been suffering from his Gettysburg wound, if you recall, a quite painful one involving his saddle. At times, he's going to have to give over his command to a subordinate, like say David Birney back in our early Petersburg assaults. He will no longer command in the field, as the wound is proving too great. Andrew Humphreys is going to replace him as commanding the 2nd Corps. Remember, Humphreys wanted to continue in field command, but he's actually pulled in by Meade to be his chief of staff, especially because Butterfield is a Hooker man, right? Like, he was under Hooker, and so he needs Humphreys to serve in that role, but Humphreys is more interested in holding a field command, so he's finally going to be given back that opportunity, and he's going to command the 2nd Corps. Hancock is an interesting figure, as he was considered for a time to be the premier field commander of the Army of the Potomac. Hancock the Superb does turn in some good performances, so this is fair. I have often pointed out how he is considered to be saving the Union Army at Gettysburg on all 3 days, which in a battle where everyone claims to save the Union might be some kind of record. Solid battlefield commander, I think, is something we can label Hancock as, though, if we are putting a kind of moniker on him. Speaking of Gettysburg, we also need to say goodbye to David McMurtry Gregg. The cavalry commander would also resign. Now, if you are a fan of the Civil War and you hear the words East Cavalry Field, I think you're automatically thinking of George Armstrong Custer. And yes, Custer did a good job leading his regiments in that part of the battle. However, it really was Gregg who had tactical control over the situation. He has helped in getting the Federal mounted arm on par with the Confederate counterparts. If Hancock is a solid commander, we can say the same of Gregg as a solid cavalry officer. These departures are just another example of the attrition, both physically and mentally, that the war will see. To close out, on November 4th, we have Nathan Bedford Forrest raiding Johnsonville, Tennessee. Now, Forrest would move 23 days into Tennessee in support of John Bell Hood, whose actions we'll cover in a future episode. Forrest originally would try to hit at Fort Hyman, which we talked about all the way back in 1862 with Forts Henry and Fort Donelson. This would significantly hamper George Thomas and his supply as he prepared to face the Confederates. Fort Hyman, though, would be off the table, but Forrest would see a viable option in moving along the Tennessee River and disrupting operations. He briefly blockaded the river and captured some vessels, including some gunboats. Moving on Johnsonville, he would move his artillery to bombard the supply depot there, and move his ship that he had captured to meet the Union vessels. While the flotilla would not work, the main Confederate ship being hit and abandoned before exploding, the artillery would do damage in hitting their naval counterparts. Forcing a capitulation of the small garrison, the total tally for Forrest would be 4 gunboats, 14 transports, 20 barges, 26 pieces of artillery, and $6.7 million. That's actually around over $100 million worth of money in modern day money, worth of property, and 150 prisoners. While this was a brief foray into naval operations for Forrest, and a success in terms of damage, Forrest was still unable to fully cease the Union operations, as we will soon see. With that, we'll go ahead and end this week's episode. We talked Lincoln's re-election this week, most likely one of the nails in the coffin for the Confederacy. There will be continued action around Petersburg, with first Hatcher's Run or first Boydton Plank Road. Forrest also raised Johnsonville, adding to his prestige. Next week, we'll turn back to Georgia. We will see about the event that William Tecumseh Sherman is most known for, the March to the Sea. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website, as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.